Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our participants across the world. I'm Doug Silliman, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and I want to thank you for joining us for AGSIW's program, Kuwait After Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed al-Sabah. This program will be on the record. This morning, we're going to talk about the significant developments in Kuwait following the passing last week of Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed. But I want to begin today's program by offering my congratulations and best wishes to the new Emir, Sheikh Nawaf al-Ahmed al-Sabah. And in Washington today, we woke up to the news that he has designated Sheikh Michel al-Ahmed al-Sabah to be the next Crown Prince. But before we jump into this news and the next steps for Kuwait, I'd like to say a few words about the late Emir, Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed al-Jaber al-Sabah, Allah yirhamu. Those of us who served in Kuwait or have spent a lot of time there have a great affection for the country and for the people of Kuwait. And much of the character of Kuwait and the way that the world sees Kuwait is due to the decades-long career of the late Emir. There are three thoughts I want to address today: the late Emir's impact on how Kuwait deals with the world, his impact in the humanitarian sphere, and his impact on Kuwaiti society. So first, Kuwait in the world. Sabah al-Ahmed was appointed foreign minister in 1963, just 2 years after Kuwait's independence. And it is Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed who built Kuwait's relationship with the world. He knew that as a small country in a dangerous neighborhood and surrounded by much larger nations, Kuwait had to garner the support of the whole world to survive and prosper. This became particularly true in 1990 when Saddam Hussein's army invaded and occupied Kuwait. Sabah al-Ahmed orchestrated the construction of the international coalition to liberate Kuwait, and he also launched Kuwait's very close and now enduring partnership with the United States. Following liberation, it was Sabah al-Ahmed who expanded Kuwait's network of support, opening Kuwaiti missions across the world and enticing countries even from faraway Africa and Latin America to open up embassies in Kuwait. He wanted to make sure that the whole world knew and liked Kuwait should it ever need the world's help again. And his influence was particularly felt in the region. Early in his career, he supported Arab causes, and later he became the Gulf's mediator and peacemaker, helping mediate disputes between Pakistan and Bangladesh, Jordan and the Palestinian Authority. And he played a significant role in the birth of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and over the past decade worked hard to reduce the tensions within that alliance, especially between Qatar and Kuwait's other Gulf partners. Through these actions, he played a crucial role in defining the world's view of Kuwait. Second, Sabah al-Ahmed sought to use Kuwait's influence and its wealth to lessen the impact of war and poverty on people across the world. Kuwait, under his leadership, became a major donor to development projects, particularly in education and for refugees. In the region, he took the initiative to host 3 donors' conferences for Syria. This was an issue about which he felt very passionately, and in my most uncomfortable meeting with the Emir when I was ambassador in Kuwait, he berated the United States for failing to use its power and influence to make a deal to end the fighting in Syria. Perhaps most interestingly, he was also a great supporter of Iraq, despite or maybe because of the 1990 invasion. He was the only significant Arab head of state who attended the 2012 Arab League Summit in Baghdad when I was in Baghdad, and he hosted a donors conference for Iraq. And the late Emir once told me that Kuwait needed to make sure that Iraq turned out right. Otherwise, Iraq's problems would become Kuwait's problems. Finally, he also played a defining role in Kuwaitis' view of themselves. In 2003, after having spent 4 decades as foreign minister, the then Emir, Sheikh Jaber al-Ahmed, appointed him as prime minister. And among the more specific accomplishments he had is during his time as prime minister, the legislation to permit Kuwaiti women to vote passed the National Assembly. And in the first years that he was emir, the first female candidates competed and won seats in the National Assembly. He also saw himself as the protector of his people. I remember very clearly the day of the bombing of the Shia Imam Sadiq Mosque in 2015, in which 27 Kuwaitis were killed and more than 200 were injured. The emir rushed to the scene against the advice of his security detail, and visibly shaken by what he saw there, he declared, "Hedula ayali," those are my people. The response from Kuwaitis was seen in hundreds of billboards all around the country in the following days. Wa intum abuna, and you are our father. For his work to teach the world about Kuwait, for his efforts to use Kuwait's resources for the good around the world, and for his role in forming the identity that many Kuwaitis have today of their own country, Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed truly was the father of modern Kuwait. So I want to thank all of you for indulging my reminiscences about the late Emir. Now we want to look to Kuwait's future, and we have gathered for you a spectacular panel of academic experts and practitioners. You can see the full bios of our guests on the AGSIW website, www.agsiw.org. Ambassador Skip Gnehm was the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait in 1991 and reopened the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait after liberation. He also served as ambassador to Australia and to Jordan, and he is now the Kuwait Professor of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the Elliott School at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. Skip is also a mentor and a friend, and I very much appreciate him being here. Ambassador Deborah Jones was the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait from 2008 to 2011, and also U.S. ambassador to Libya and our consul general in Istanbul, Turkey. She's a frequent analyst and commentator on both the Gulf and on North Africa, and is with us here quite frequently at AGSIW. Dr. Badr al-Saif is an assistant professor of history at Kuwait University and a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. He has a PhD with distinction from Georgetown University and is the author of several critically acclaimed studies of the region. Dr. Badr, welcome. Dr. Alanoud al-Sharekh is a consulting partner at Ibtikar Strategic Consultancy in Kuwait and has also authored several award-winning studies, particularly of Kuwait. She is a non-resident fellow here at AGSIW, and I first got to know Alanoud as an activist in the Abolish 153 campaign in Kuwait several years ago, and very much appreciate her activist role in Kuwait as well. And to moderate what I'm sure will be an excellent discussion is Dr. Kristin Smith-Diwan, Senior Resident Scholar here at AGSIW. Welcome to all of our guests. Kristin, the microphone is yours.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Well, I'm very eager to get into our discussion, and it's really going to be such a pleasure to have this conversation about Kuwait's future with not only we just saw Ambassador Silliman there, but two more ambassadors, all three who served in Kuwait, as well as two young, we call you young to me, and up-and-coming scholars from Kuwait themselves. So I think this is going to give us really an opportunity to get quite a breadth of perspective from people who have engaged in Kuwait from all different levels, from both the practitioner level and the steep experience at the height of government to analyst positions and as citizens. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I thought I would start, I know the ambassador just gave us a pretty lengthy remembrance of Sheikh Sabah, but I wanted just to invite you as well, not so much to give a long remembrance, but just to think a bit about what you think is the most important legacy that Sheikh Sabah gave to Kuwait, or just an important element of his rule, and maybe link that with an idea about if you see continuity then moving forward in this important area. So why don't we start with Ambassador Gnehm, since you were there at a very critical time in Kuwait's history.
Good. Well, the immediate thought that comes to my mind is the negotiations that I had with Sheikh Sabah over our agreement, status of forces agreement, which is the basis for enormously close cooperation between Kuwait and the United States Defense Department and the presence up until this day for a fairly significant American presence I just would say that he was a tough negotiator. We spent hours wrangling over some significant but pretty small details. And it just proved to me that I was dealing with someone who really knew his business well, and that was the case. And just to say that throughout the rest of my term there, and then the many visits that I've made in times when Ambassador Silliman was ambassador, Ambassador Jones was there, he was always committed to this relationship with the United States. And I think that was a clear recognition. And I remember hearing this in Taif when the government was in exile, that when we were in trouble, the only country that came to our aid really was the United States. If it hadn't been for the United States, we wouldn't be a country today. And that was particularly poignant in looking at the Arab countries that didn't come behind him as they expected. But it's all as a result of his global efforts that Ambassador Silliman mentioned, that he worked assiduously through the years, and that came to bear. And this is something that I remember, and it's something that remained important to him to the end of his life.
And is that really close tie and relationship that he built with the United States, is that something that you expect is going to continue?
I do indeed. I do indeed. Because again, I think there's just broad Kuwaiti public support for the United States presence in the country. And it's a political calculation that even today, Kuwait lives in a part of the world with 3 major countries around them, some of them in trouble and some of them aggressive. And that the way one secures independence is having an alliance with a country like the United States. And I think that will be part of the policies of the new Emir as it is a policy for the Kuwait state.
Thank you. Ambassador Jones, do you have thoughts from your experience in Kuwait? Is there one element that stands out when you think about that legacy?
Right. I think I would tag on to what Skip was saying in the instance of the pragmatism of the Emir that has, I think, characterized all of his interactions as the Dean of Arab diplomacy, as his nickname was. And as he, because also with our presence there, it's also a calibrated presence. It's a nuanced presence. Mm-hmm. It's not in your face, and there are certain guidelines that go with it, because I think he understood very well too the need of Kuwaitis to express their own sovereignty, to feel their own sovereignty in their own country. But I would also say that as I watched the episode, that I can't really go into all of the details, but it comes to mind is during the Bahrain episode with the Shia community there and Peninsula Shield coming together and trying to, some of the more assertive states in the GCC wanting to handle things one way, and Kuwait, as always, looking for a nuanced way to participate, but in a way that did not damage its own Shia community at home and its own interests as a country that has frankly managed to deal with some of these issues better than other democracy and minorities, etc., than others in the region.
Yeah, and I think that balancing role is definitely something that we always see in Kuwait that really does stem both from the composition of the community and the kind of political system that it set up. Dr. Alanoud, do you have any thoughts on what you think Sheikh Sabah will be remembered for in Kuwait?
I think I'm not going to be exaggerating when I say that Sheikh Sabah in particular was a ruler that was very close to the people. And you can see that in the pictures that people took with him personally in remembrance on their social media feeds. And also I went to his formal palaces, once in Bayan and once in Saif Palace, to meet with him. Once as a part of a civil society group, and another time as a group of Kuwaitis who received international honors and were presenting them to the Emir. So this is the type of, I would say, intimate relationship that we have with our rulers, and in particular Sheikh Sabah, who was especially easygoing and accessible as a figure. And for us, he elevated Kuwait's position in the global world. We were able to take up a position as a country of peace and of mediation because of the role that he played. And that is something that is very important to Kuwaitis, that even though we may be small in size, we are able to project our brand of diplomacy and pragmatism on a global stage, and not just a regional one.
And are there expectations, you think, in Kuwait that will be the same moving forward? Of course, it's a more difficult era Kuwait finds itself now, or maybe not, but an equally difficult era right now, and a lot of pressures to kind of take sides in a lot of different conflicts. Is that sort of an expectation moving forward with the new leadership?
On the state of foreign policy, especially in terms of regional politics, I don't see us having a great deviation from the pace that Sheikh Sabah set of, approaching things very cautiously and trying to take as balanced a view as possible. And in terms of domestic affairs, in the interim space between His Highness the late Emir going off for his medical checkups in the States, and His Highness the Emir Sheikh Nawaf being proclaimed our national leader, Sheikh Nawaf had been seeing groups of concerned Kuwaitis from both sides of the spectrum, whether they represent Islamist views or they represent liberal views. They have been going to see him in the palace and presenting what they think are the most pressing issues in Kuwait. So I don't see that this very close communication between the ruled and those who rule them going to change with the new Emir.
Dr. Deborah, maybe, do you want to add something on that? Another idea about how Kuwaitis viewed the reign of Sheikh Sabah, and if they expect changes from that moving forward under Sheikh Nawaf?
I tend to agree with everything that's been stated so far. Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed is truly a class act for Kuwait and the region. Not only is his career intertwined with the founding and the evolution of modern Kuwait, but he has nurtured what I call brand Kuwait, the search for, incessant search for peace, the ability to balance powers, the mediation of differences, the attempt to de-escalate conflicts. And if there is one thing that I would single out as a signature policy that would outlast him, and he has many policies that would outlast him, would be the relationship with Iraq. And I trace this back to the 60s when we first saw the threats coming in, and how he was able to manage that relationship, that very thorny relationship at the time, and it going through the ebbs and flows of us being occupied, and then him having the farsightedness to ensure that he maintains that openness and connection with all the countries that stood with Iraq during the occupation. And he was the first Arab leader to reach out to Iraq after the ouster of Saddam. He was the first Arab leader, certainly from the Gulf, to go to Iraq in the Arab Summit in 2012. And as you know, Kuwait hosted, and it was his idea. If you speak to his advisors, they were even surprised at the time to hear him come up with the idea of hosting the Iraq Reconstruction Summit in 2018. That shows you the interest and the intent of maintaining peace and stability in the region. And I agree that this kind of foreign policy will not disappear. We have the architect, or one of the architects of the brand, depart, but the country and the brand lives on.
Well, we are, in the midst, even today, and of this leadership transition in Kuwait. We now have, of course, this smooth transition from the Emir to his half-brother, Sheikh Nawaf al-Ahmed, who's now moved ahead to appoint his crown prince, also another half-brother, Sheikh Mishal, who is expected then to get approval before the parliament tomorrow, I believe. So what can we expect from this new leadership team? Obviously, there's a lot of continuity and seeing this kind of transition. But I wanted to turn first to the ambassadors and just draw upon the experience that they've had. I'm sure you've been able to meet some of these pivotal figures. So what do you think about what we're going to see moving forward?
I might step in then first, and I'm sure Deborah will have her thoughts as well, because she was there in period after me. One of the things that I learned quite clearly during my tenure there was the traditional way the emirs and the crown princes had operated. And this was, excuse me for taking a little bit of time to answer this question, because it was something that came to my mind immediately when I heard of Sheikh Sabah's death. I went to see Sheikh Jabir, his predecessor, over an issue. I rarely did that. In fact, maybe only twice in all the time. And he looked at me and speaking in English. I could tell from Tawfiq, who was the translator, he was shocked that the emir was going to answer in English. He said, you know, Skip, when I was the prime minister, the emir then did not engage in the governing. That was my responsibility. And I've been very diligent in not being involved. But give me a little time. And I understood that what he meant. But what I'm getting at is that traditionally, the emirs have not been engaged in the day-to-day issues. And that was enormous contrast with the way Sheikh Sabah ruled. He was engaged all the time. In fact, if I, in the interest of time, would just say, it was very, very clear to me when I traveled back there that no action was taken by the government, not by the council of ministers or anyone else, without either the approval of the emir or knowing that they were doing what he wanted them to do, because he was that much engaged. It's very different. So going quickly to your question, my impression from knowing Sheikh Nawaf from the early 90s, both in Taif when he was Minister of Defense and afterwards, and visiting with him, is that he is a far different personality when it comes to engagement. I remember a story that I was told by a member of the family as a result of the discussion in the family circle about who would be the crown prince when Sheikh Sabah was then named to take over the emirship. And the person quoted Sheikh Nawaf when he was asked if he would take on the role and be the prime minister again. He said, and these are the words I heard, no, I don't want anything to do with running the government. And I actually think that is reflective of his own views. He's a patriot. He cares about the country as much as anyone does, but I don't think he's inclined at all to be as engaged as Sheikh Sabah was, which leads into some interesting questions then about how the governance in the country will go. And I'm sure that's where you want the conversation ultimately to go. Mm-hmm. But the selection of a very strong crown prince, I thought was going to be necessary or was going to likely. And that particular selection, and this is Sheikh Mashal, is likely to be taking on a lot of the roles that the previous prime ministers have done. Now, whether he's going to be, crown princes have done, whether he's going to be the prime minister, I don't know. I suspect that might in fact be the case, but we will see. And I'll stop because I'm sure Deborah and Dr. Badr and Dr. Alanoud will have some views on this as well.
Yeah, thank you. Ambassador Deborah, if you could go ahead. I'm just wondering if you have any personal reflections from your...
Right. So yes, having met both and, dealt with His Highness Sheikh Nawaf, who is, as Skip says, he's a contemplative person. He's watching, he's quiet. I think the tradition has been also that you don't express an opinion when there is an emir ruling. I mean, that's not his job as the Wali Ahmed. Now, but I do believe with Skip that given the personality of Mashal, given his Sheikh Mashal, given his close relationship to the emir, to Sheikh Sabah, and I think people need to remember that, again, not only was he the one who accompanied him on his last visit, he also accompanied him to the States when he would go for very delicate conversations involving things like the Guantanamo detainees and other things. So he's much more hands-on. He's much more, he's a commander of the National Guard. He's going to have I think, be a little more assertive than as the Wali Ahmed than Sheikh Nawaf was. My view, I may be wrong, and I do suspect it may be. We'll see. It may be that he is the one who deals more with the National Assembly. In some ways, we'll see how they react, and I think it may be some time before we see where the prime minister emerges. And I will leave this to our Kuwaiti friends who have much better understanding of the internal side.
Well, maybe let's turn there then. And I just wanted to first get impressions of Kuwaitis, and of course, we know Kuwaitis have a lot of different viewpoints. There's not any way you're going to capture all of Kuwait's viewpoints. Even with just two panelists, but just to give some impressions of how Kuwaitis are viewing this transition and the new leadership. So why don't we start with you, Dr. Alanoud?
Well, as you said, I don't think Badr and I can cover the feelings of all Kuwaitis, but we'll certainly try. What I think is important is that the smooth transition of power is reassuring, as is the speed by which a crown prince was chosen and hopefully will be voted on and affirmed through the constitutional process in Parliament tomorrow.
This is surprising. Can I just ask, because of course we know that Sheikh Nawaf as Emir, according to the Constitution, he had a year to select a crown prince. Were the expectations that he might take more time to do that?
Well, it is difficult to predict these things because there's also family consensus by tradition. So he chooses somebody, but it has to be somebody that the family council also agrees on. And I think it was perhaps more important at this time to choose somebody quickly, and somebody that is not a figure that there's a lot of controversy around, because of the difficult time that we're going through during Corona, because of the economic issues that have come up, and because there has been some unhappiness in Kuwait over allegations of corruptions, etc. So I think by naming a crown prince and by ensuring a smooth transition of power to a new ruler and to have continuity with the new crown prince is very important at this time. And this is something that is, I feel, and that I'm sensing is reassuring to people of Kuwait. And what is also interesting about the choice of our new crown prince, Sheikh al-Ahmed, is that he is not somebody that has been exposed to engagements with the parliament in his career. He is not somebody that has been questioned or put through an interrogation. So he's a figure that hasn't been involved in these kinds of arguments within Parliament. And him and our Emir Sheikh Nawaf al-Ahmed are also not figures that go out in the media a lot or speak out about things. They're much more reserved, and it feels like, in a way, a kind of a return, as Ambassador Gnehm said, to the era of Sheikh Jaber al-Ahmed, where there is kind of a very cautious media presence around the Emir and the ruling court.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Badr, I'm curious about how you see that and that sort of balance between the need for a smooth transition and the reassurance that offers. But also, this is a transition that stays within the same generation of leadership in Kuwait. I know you've written quite a lot and thought also about youth politics. Actually, both of you have. How do you kind of see this transition and that balance between the need for reassurance and then some desire for change as well that Dr. Alanoud has kind of introduced?
Sheikh Nawaf al-Ahmed has broken the record by naming or nominating his crown prince in 8 days after his assumption of power. When Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed broke that record, and it was 9 days, for him to name Nawaf al-Ahmed as a crown prince back in 2006, Kuwaitis were surprised, and I would say some members of the ruling family as well. Now that has even accelerated, and that shows the keenness of the emir in sending out a message that the ruling family is united. And that message is to Kuwaitis first, and also to the ruling family from within. As you know, there has been a lot of bickering in previous years. So this quickness and swiftness in naming the crown prince, and a person that everyone rallied around. We see senior members of the ruling family even tweeting in support of that nomination to brush any concerns of any type of misinterpretation that might accrue. And as you know, with any succession in the region, in the Gulf, neighbors tend to listen in to see what would happen to any given country that goes through such a process. So I think that was a well-deserved move. And let me now tie it to the Constitution, Kristin. The Constitution does not say much about the heir apparent. That's the label for the Crown Prince in the Constitution. It references the nomination process in Article 4. It references the vacancy of the seat. But then if you go to the succession law, which came in 1964, 13 months after the Constitution, Article 7 gives a loose mandate to the emir to decide whatever he deems fit of a mandate for the Crown Prince. Now, let me bring in the history of Crown Princes in Kuwait. We cannot take any specific case as a model. We've always had the Crown Prince position tied to the Prime Minister. The first time that this was done and that this was separated was in 2003, when we ended up with Sheikh Saad being a Crown Prince only, but he had had that Prime Minister experience. So in actuality, the only person to occupy that position and that position alone at one given time without going through the Prime Ministership was Sheikh Nawaf al-Ahmed. And him being alongside Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed all these decades and earning the trust of Sabah al-Ahmed and previous emirs is telling to the level of continuity that we're seeing in the system, and that is much needed, I would say, at this time. There will always be that balance between trying to move ahead with certain change and development and with maintaining that Kuwaiti way of managing differences and moving forward. And with the appointment or the nomination, the appointment officially tomorrow, but the nomination today of Mish'al al-Ahmed, the Emir is sending that message of continuity. And in terms of what files he'll be holding, I would tend, for this selection, I think it's very important to tie it to the Prime Minister choice, to who's going to come to occupy that position, one. And second, who will be the senior ruling family members who will occupy the key posts in the government. I think putting those two together will give us a better sense of the direction of the new Emir Sheikh Nawaf. I would not take the decision of nominating Sheikh Mish'al alone as an indicator. I would wait and see how that moves forward with the other selections.
Well, you phrased, I think, a couple of the, the directions that we probably want to take the conversation in a couple avenues. One is on the level of the ruling family politics and consensus within the council of how to move forward. Of course, that's not something that we could have taken for granted necessarily. We've seen a lot of public, even public conflict and competition, especially over, I guess, what you could call sort of next generation leadership, or maybe not next generation leadership, some elements of it being next generation leadership, but definitely between, who was going to have the leading position for the succession and in Kuwait's politics and the direction moving forward. Do you think it is, does this kind of selection, staying very at this kind of conservative choice and allowing continuity, do you think that is going to eliminate this kind of competition that we've seen amongst ruling family members? Or do you expect, as you said, in the formation of the government, to see some of these different competing factions kind of brought into the governance structure? And we'll just stay with you, and then we'll see what others have to think, Dr. Badr.
So let me start with how I see Sheikh Mish'al al-Ahmed, and then how that trickles down into the ruling family. To me, I see him as both an insider and an outsider. And having that unique combination is important for Kuwait at this moment. How is he both an insider and an outsider? First of all, he's an insider by being very close to the rulers all these decades. He's the one who accompanies the emirs. He attends all the state visits in his capacity as Deputy National Guard, head of National Guard, but also as being the sibling of the rulers there. So that cumulative knowledge does not translate into a line in a CV. It's just cumulative, and it's the way of grooming up leadership. So in a sense, he's an insider in that fashion. How is he an outsider? He's an outsider in that he has not gone into the willy-nilly type of bickering that we've seen happen between the different ministers from the ruling family, or in terms of being exposed to allegations of corruption as some other members of the family have been. So having that aspect of freshness or outsideness is something that was, although expected to be named as a crown prince, but having that element is needed. Now, how can he'll be a stabilizing force in checking in any attempt from within the ruling family to expose themselves in a way that we've seen in the past that would allow for more competition. I think the competition will continue. It's healthy to have competition, but it will be a competition that serves the needs of Kuwait. And I think that will reflect itself in the next government formation. We're going to see a return of certain figures back into the government as part of that understanding. And they will be working together to ensuring that they can prove themselves to be worthy of the next step up.
Ambassador Deborah, I saw you nodding your head at some elements of that. Do you want to kind of share your thoughts on these relations within the ruling family and how you think that they'll play out? And of course, we're in the midst of this transition. I think, as Al-Saif said, we know now who the crown prince, has been proposed, but we still have to see how the government forms.
Probably the safest thing for me to say is I agree with everything that Dr. Badr has said. And I do think that there are elements that do need to be brought back in because of the natural, how shall I say, constituencies they have within Kuwait that all need to be knit back into a healthy national body politic. So I don't want to, beyond that, I think, we have people who are charismatic, people who have had relationships. I'm often inclined to think, and I don't want to put this in a negative sense though, but of President Johnson's famous saying that I'd rather have people inside the tent, and I will say spitting out, than outside of the tent spitting in. And I think that's something that Sheikh Sabah understood very well as part of the consensus piece. And I do think in Kuwait, the challenge has always been, from my outside perspective, which is very different, that sometimes the search for consensus can be so compelling or so strong that absent ijma or consensus, their inactivity is an acceptable alternative. And I think this has been something, but it's been interesting over time, because when I was there, I would see a lot of frustration sometimes with younger Kuwaitis who would say, why can't we be more like, Abu Dhabi or Dubai? It's all moving so quickly and we move so slowly. But I think over time, people have seen the wisdom of having buy-in from all parts. And I think it's going to be very important. Now, this gets into other areas and I don't want to move beyond that, but I do think, I do agree with Dr. Badr's assessment that it's going to be time to knit other points back in. And Sheikh Mish'al, in fact, is, maybe he's like potentially a Joe Biden, but someone who knows how to play that game who's not been a subject of scandal or of has been in the public sphere, but is a known quantity and is a trusted person who knows all the background, all this, he's been there, he's been on the ground, and as Badr said, there's no substitute for that kind of experience.
Dr. Alanoud, I'm curious because I know when, you know, as an outsider looking at this transition and even had in discussions with many Kuwaitis, of course, you know, one person who often was mentioned was the late Emir's son, Nasser al-Sabah al-Ahmed. And I think I bring him up because he weds together two of these elements that were brought up, right? One more recently being very public, I think, about some of the challenges of corruption within the ruling family, bringing them right out into the open. So that's kind of the tendency where Dr. Badr said they may want to not expose all of these things or do it in a different way. And also really championing, I think at least out in front, championing this idea of change, at least is captured in the New Kuwait program, which is, you know, sort of the vision for moving Kuwait forward, perhaps through a new sort of mega project, this new city, Silk City. But in some sense also just in capturing this sort of desire, I think, for change and to shake things up in Kuwait. So I don't know, I'm just wondering how you see sort of the balance between these different challenges under the new leadership.
Kristin, you know, in Kuwait, we are people who have a voice, and the decisions are not just top down. We are the only country in the Gulf that 2 prime ministers from the ruling family had to resign because they were not popular with the people and because there were allegations of corruptions, even though they were chosen by our beloved Emir. And this is, I think, the beauty of politics in Kuwait, that if you want to create change, you have to have buy-in, and buy-in from a majority of the Kuwaitis. As Ambassador Jones says, sometimes getting that buy-in is a slow process and you have a bit of inertia in the middle, but this is brand Kuwait, as Badr said. These are the values that we hold dear and the values that those that rule Kuwait appreciate and understand as part of the process. Young people in Kuwait especially, they have been very vocal about the things that they feel need to change and need to let's say, modernize. The late Emir responded to that by creating a National Youth Council that eventually became a standalone ministry to deal with youth affairs. And the voice of the youth was also heard when Sheikh Nasser, the late Emir's son, was in charge of looking at ways to get stakeholder buy-in for the New Kuwait project. It can't just be a government communication exercise. You know, we're building infrastructure. It has to also capture the imagination of the new generation of Kuwait. It has to be communicated to them as partners as well as citizens, because that is really how things are run in Kuwait. And although our Emir and his brother, our Crown Prince, are from an older generation, there are many well-educated, dedicated members, both of the ruling family and of Kuwait's citizenry, who are going to step up and fill positions in the government to fulfill this. And we've seen having a younger man heading our parliament as speaker. I mean, it can lead to a lot of fireworks because of the energy there, but you have somebody who is willing to engage in a process of legislation and following up, and we are confident that we're going to see this energy also in the choice of people to lead our government in this critical and important stage.
Well, I think Dr. Alanoud is bringing up this whole issue of the relationship between the leadership and parliament, which is such a critical one for Kuwait, and of course has been one of a lot of friction. And I think that does bring up this issue that you brought up earlier, Ambassador Gnehm, about how you see the government formation taking place under Sheikh Nawaf and now Sheikh Mishal as his crown prince. and the separation that we talked about, particularly between the crown prince and this head of government, the prime minister, and that relationship then as well to the parliament, of course, having that main engagement. Do you expect then, I think you mentioned before, but do you expect then to see that linkage again between the crown prince position and the prime minister? And if I could just say, is it a bit of a concern that we have now, an emir who has been described kind of likes to stand above or kind of be a unifying figure, yes, but a bit more apart from politics, and now a crown prince named, and of course still has to be approved through the parliament, who hasn't really been engaged in that kind of rough and tumble of Kuwait politics, or hasn't thrown himself into that as of yet.
Well, I was very taken by Dr. Bader's observations. I thought they were really right on. But as he talked, I began to revise some of the feelings I had when the panel actually started, which is that there are sort of two ways that we can go, right? That Kuwait could go, sorry, I didn't mean me. And that is that they could decide that they want to see the crown prince again be the prime minister, bringing the two together. And because he is the outsider as well as the insider, he brings both of those advantages to that role. There was, of course, in the past opposition to having those two together, because that would protect the prime minister from interrogation by the parliament, because you can't interrogate the crown prince in the same way you can the current prime ministership. But again, I think because he's not been embroiled in politics and even family feuds, at least not noticeably, gives him great advantage. But there's another alternative. This is where I was going. And that is that they decide that he's not going to be the prime minister, so that he doesn't end up having to take on the kinds of controversies and the kind of issues on a day-to-day basis that a prime minister has to do. But he will play a role on the outside of that to, in effect, bridge, maybe help compromise, help advise, or lend his influence or weight that either assists in these other relationships. So, I could see advantages for him not being the prime minister if he's actually going to be playing, which I do expect because of his personality. He's going to be engaged. And that's why I've leaned in the direction of him taking on the prime ministership, but I can see the other route as a possibility as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we leave domestic politics, we do have elections coming up in Kuwait, or I expect that they will take place the end of November, beginning of December. I don't think the date has been completely fixed yet. Maybe we can turn to Dr. Badr and Dr. Alanoud just to give us some expectations, what we see for those elections. I mean, a lot of the issues that have been coming up have been circulating around these more populist kind of topics of corruption, and tackling those sorts of things, as well as the challenges of just coming through this era that that is making for all of us a really difficult time, of course, with the coronavirus, challenges of that. What do you kind of see coming from the election? What are the main issues that you see being brought forward? Dr. Badr, if you want to start us.
So the deadlock between the executive and legislative branches is nothing new. It seems to be as if it's a part of the Kuwaiti political system. I think with the transition from one emir to another, and as we have seen in the Gulf, it's usually a time of coming together. It's a time of reconciliation. And we've seen the emir in his function as deputy emir in the last 2 weeks before him assuming power. He has received various opposition figures, various members of parliament that do not see eye to eye with the government, both current and former, and they've raised their opinions. They've suggested ways forward. I think, as the ambassadors and Alanoud have said, Sheikh Nawaf is a perceptive person. He listens, and I think we will see some kind of openings on the domestic file, on the domestic scene in general, as we move forward, and that spirit will reflect itself I would think, in the election season. Now, it's not going to be your typical election because of COVID. There won't be those campaigning outdoors and in tents and what have you, and it will be a different kind of campaigning, but I think the issues remain. And as you know, we have an economic problem looming that needs to be tackled ASAP. We have lurking corruption allegations that this current government has began addressing and began tackling. We need to see more of that. And I know that the citizenry would like to also see kind of resolution on these files. And we also would like to have a better sense of firmness. And that's the trait that gets to be associated with Sheikh Nawaf, being both firm and modest. So having that also reflected or spiraling down into his choices in government to ensure that the speed upon which he named or nominated his crown prince becomes the trait that moves forward with other policies in Kuwait.
Mm. Well, we have, you mentioned a lot of the people meeting with Sheikh Nawaf in this interim period. Amongst them was a group of opposition people who put forth a kind of Project Kuwait, a kind of proposal for what they would like to see going forward. And I will say being raised a lot still is that whole issue about the electoral law, a number of votes that people have in parliament that was changed, of course, back in 2012, I believe, so that Kuwaitis now only have one vote, and there's a desire to see that increased. Do you think that that's a possibility, that could take place before the elections? Or also, I might as well just throw it in there too. There's also the idea about prominent opposition figures that are living in exile or somehow pardoning people that have been involved in oppositional politics before.
Everything is on the table, Kristin. And I think that's part of the innovative nature of coming together under a new emir, that the possibilities are all open for him. He has the final say to decide how to ensure that his legacy is put forward. He is known to be a keen listener, as I said. He will be listening into different opinions. And we've seen those abroad bringing up notions of support and putting out a public letter praising him and praising his leadership. So I think there will be some healing to come. The character and the nature of that healing is yet to be determined, but I see it coming, no doubt.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Alanoud, do you want to add anything to that? And I know particularly on the economic side as well, if you want to address that issue.
I'd address the upcoming elections, because I think we're all excited and curious. And as you know, I work with a lot of candidates, especially female and independent candidates running for office. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but especially excited over this upcoming election for two reasons. The last election in 2016 brought in a very strong change within parliament, even along tribal primary lines. So the big tribes in Kuwait lost a lot of seats and were replaced with representatives from small tribes. The Islamist parties were shocked that their usually loyal voter base decided to deviate from the norms. And this to me indicates that as our voters get younger, it gets more difficult to predict who they will vote for and what appeals to them. This upcoming election, it'll be very interesting to see what agendas the candidates are putting forward, especially that we have a new emir and a new crown prince. And so a lot of the inherited grievances, I'd say that were recycled in every election cycle and were brought up again, they can't be used or used as profusely in place of a very clear agenda for what they will do in their time in parliament. And so I feel like perhaps, as you said, the economic crisis and this push and pull between a government trying to lessen the wage bill and trying to introduce taxes, introduce a system of economic reform, and make sure that Kuwait is aligned with changes that we've seen in the GCC for its own financial sustainability, and between parliamentarians who represent what they see are the basic needs of Kuwaiti citizens and part of the patronage agreement between the citizens and those who rule them to provide a certain quality of life, which includes subsidies. So I think that will be the main economic issue that is going to come up during the election season, and we're going to see it play out in Parliament as well.
Okay. Well, we're already getting a lot of questions, but as usual, is my interest delved a lot into the domestic politics inside Kuwait, but we do need to think a little bit about how the new leadership might position Kuwait regionally. I don't know, Ambassador Gnehm, do you expect shifts? We know that Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed was, of course, well known for his mediation, both within the Gulf crisis and also in being a facilitator, sort of in passing letters from Iran at key moments as well to Gulf partners. Do you expect that orientation of Kuwait to continue?
I certainly do. I think that, as was said earlier by our Kuwaiti colleagues this morning, that the foreign policy that was set under Sheikh Sabah is one that's very much in the interest of Kuwait. They have to be very careful in treading the way they go. I think it will go on. Deborah mentioned one example. I'm remembering another one. That was when there was I think the Saudi embassy in Tehran was burned, and the Saudis wanted their other friends in the region to break relations. They put pressure on Kuwait. Kuwait was quite concerned. And what did they do? They withdrew their ambassador for consultations, but they did not break relations, which is a perfect example of exercising some wisdom, not fully complying with the pressure they were under, but also cognizant of the situation. So I do think that will continue. I think what won't continue, frankly, is that the leadership, at least initially, is not in a position to be as active in mediating crises in the region at all, because that was such a factor of Sheikh Sabah's long-term engagement, involvement, knowledge, and abilities, hewn over a long period of time. And that doesn't come with either the new emir. And this is not necessarily a hostile remark at all. It is just a fact of life that he's not been engaged in this, and neither has Sheikh Mashal. And so I think that while they will continue to be a moderating force in all of these disputes, like within the GCC, no question about that, there won't be the same impact of their engagement.
Ambassador Jones, I know that you served in Turkey, so I was thinking to ask you this question about a lot of the regional coalitions that have been shaping up, and of course some of the challenges of Kuwait as a small country to kind of deal with those. I think I saw that President Erdogan, in fact, was in Kuwait today offering his condolences. Do you see Kuwait taking any sort of different position in navigating these kind of regional waters that are set by, some really strong players amongst Gulf neighbors, UAE and Saudi Arabia, and a more conflictual relationship that they seem to be emerging between both Turkey on one side and at times Iran?
Yeah, thank you for that softball question, Kristin. I mean, it's something that I've been thinking obviously a lot about, but in this case, I think I would second Skip's analysis of the role of a different kind of role. I think that Kuwait, quite frankly, I'm glad that we are aligned, I think, with Kuwait in general, the US and Kuwait, and it's a nice fulcrum to have us there in the country, I think, too, because if Kuwait has the wherewithal, that it doesn't need to make concessions the way that some other countries might feel that they've had to some of the more ambitious goals or activities of some of these other countries. I think that Kuwait has a strong sense of self and its identity, and also is in a position where it actually can be more, have more freedom of own activity and its own decisions in these things. And so in that sense can continue to be balanced, I think, in terms of how it responds to some of these others. Look, I mean, there's no question that there are going to be all kinds of pressure points, not even the traditional pressure points. We already know that social media, for example, or kind of soft power, which can be just as malignant as hard power, has been working its way to try to influence many things there. But I do believe that the biggest challenge for Kuwait right now is going to be to have a National Assembly that works in line with an executive right now for the well-being of the Kuwaiti state, to strengthen the state, to give it the means that it needs to continue to sustain its independent position. And as I say, having the U.S. in a similarly, it's hard to say sometimes these days, frankly, what our positions are, but I do think that we remain quite neutral, and on the contrary, we're quite supportive of what the Emir's position was on the GCC split, also in terms of not choosing sides in some of these larger regional, problems and issues. I think that's the place to stay, and I think that's where Kuwait needs to maintain itself as well. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Does anybody else want to address that issue? Of course, it has been brought up, this whole question. A lot of people do speculate that about the potential for sort of foreign influence within Kuwait on some of these issues. Anybody else want to tackle that?
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, Kuwaitis and their foreign policy in the Gulf see themselves as, a big part of the architecture of this Khaliji union, the fact that it's a unified Gulf. And we've seen how a unified Gulf protects itself better and agrees on commerce and agrees on border issues much better than a divided Gulf. And I think that this idea behind the architecture of the Gulf is deeply embedded within Kuwaiti culture and within Kuwaiti foreign policy. So in terms of the GCC rift, I think we will always be moving towards more of unification than the kind of, giving too much space for these rifts between us to grow and become really divisive. And I'm hopeful that we will be healing those rifts, just like we'll be healing some of the domestic issues.
And if I may add, I mean, we have domestic priorities, and there will be a sense of Kuwait looking inwards as it targets and addresses these priorities and challenges, but it will not let go of its legacy across the region and as a voice of moderation and peace. The foreign policy that was laid out by His Highness late Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed has infiltrated into different layers of policymaking, of cadres in the foreign ministry, of, as Alanoud says, the popular sentiment of the common person in Kuwait, that feeling of Khalijiness and that sense of the Kuwait foreign establishment moving forward with healing the rift. We've seen, while the late Emir was in medical treatment in the US, Sheikh Nawaf, the foreign ministry, have been moving forward in addressing this rift. A few days before the passing of the late Emir, Sheikh Ahmed al-Nasr was in Qatar, sending a letter, a handwritten letter from Sheikh Nawaf to the Emir of Qatar. So it's not, I mean, yes, he is a key architect of the brand, but as he always says in his official statements, I will leave, but the country lives on. And I think that legacy will continue to characterize Kuwait.
I'm going to move on because we do have a number of questions, and maybe if I can just tie it onto your comments, Badr, because it's so closely linked. We have Victor Tricot was asking about the role of the parliament in setting foreign policy. You're kind of talking a little bit about that popular sentiment, but do you see a role for parliament or any shift in the leadership transition to affect that?
The parliament and the government, I mean, they bicker a lot over various files, but when it comes to foreign policy, we could see more of a coming together of voices. One example, the Palestinian issue and the whole normalization question that came up and arose in concerning Kuwait joining that path of normalizing, we've seen corresponding views by the government through the Prime Minister in his UNGA address and through a government statement on the one hand, and we've seen close to 37 MPs raise out a statement declaring their objection to any kind of normalization, connected to a lot of civil societies and youth expressing themselves even on social media, pushing for that. So that harmony between voices on this one file could be replicated on others. The Yemen war, the Gulf Rift, the relationships with our neighbors, ones that are measured by respect, yet preserving the interest of Kuwait. We see it with Iraq, with Iran, Turkey, and so on. So I see this continuing, no doubt.
And if I can make a pitch, we actually have a blog on our website from another Kuwaiti scholar, Wafa Sayed, kind of looking at that issue. So I would recommend that to you as well. Other questions having to do a lot with the economy. I have one from Justin Alexander at MENA Advisors, who's referencing, of course, the current challenge in Kuwait, having Kuwait suffered for its first ever credit rating downgrade. And he mentions that the Minister of Finance says there isn't financing to pay salaries beyond November. And a local economist, Ali Al-Salam, created a stir this week proposing a universal basic income to replace unproductive government jobs and subsidies. So those are two different elements, but we have a number of people referencing the current kind of financial tensions and challenge, especially around the budget and the need for fiscal reform. I don't know, Dr. Alanoud, I don't know if you want to address the economic issue.
Well, I think I spoke about this before. Mm-hmm. There are certainly real issues with the wage bill in Kuwait and the expectations of a lot of Kuwaitis to work in government jobs and to be subsidized in their lifestyles. And that is not necessarily sustainable, especially with the oil prices fluctuating. And the reason that Kuwait is not able to push through the reforms is also because we have an active and powerful parliament that represents the people, and this is an unpopular choice. People don't want to be taxed and they don't want these painful reforms to happen, but also because there are powerful elites within the private sector that may not want to also engage in this process of releasing some monopolies, and it has to be a whole cohesive structure, and it's not going to be an easy one, but it is something that needs to happen for Kuwait's future. And you know, a lot of the statements that are made, a lot of these grandiose doomsday statements, they are there, I think, more to raise an alarm than as a reflection of actual fact. So I think we have to take some of those statements that are in the media with a pinch of salt and not as an actual reality.
Just on a very narrow subject then, do you expect that there will be passed, I guess there's the need to address the debt issue more immediately though. Do you expect that there's going to be something done? The parliament wasn't able to do that. Do you expect something to be taken in the interim in between the parliaments or after a new parliament is elected perhaps?
Well, I think that this will be a priority certainly for the new parliament. And although there are some decisions that can be made outside of parliamentary sessions and pushed through, they usually have to then be ratified by the parliament when it comes back in. So there has to be strong synchronization between the coming parliament and the coming government.
There's another issue linked to the economy and something that's come up very much in this era of coronavirus and also with the more populist politics in Kuwait. Charles asks, what direction do you think Kuwait will take regarding migrant workers under the new leadership? And this, of course, has been a big issue with the press for more Kuwaitis to enter into the private sector workforce and to lessen the number of foreign workers inside the country. I don't know, Dr. Badr, do you want to address that topic?
Yes, this is not a new subject. This has been the issue of discussion for many years and covered by many governments. The situation that we're in today in terms of a severe population imbalance is not only a reflection of Kuwait, but the region as a whole. And the type of suggestions that should come forward should not be impulsive and they should not be reactive. And I think there is foreign talent to be tapped into in terms of workers. And there should be a way in which we regulate and balance out both the interests of the country and those who are part and parcel of the country as long-term residents as well. And if I can tag along another issue that's connected in a way, this parliament and the government have had certain proposals to address the whole Bidoon issue. And we haven't seen anything come to fruition on this very important file as well. But the intent of trying to push this file, and I know this file was high up on the agenda of Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed, the late Sheikh Sabah, and he's enhanced the suggestion that we saw being, articulated in Parliament with a certain law, and then another counter law coming up. I think just having that out in the open, being discussed in that much detail, is a good sign. And I'm hoping that the new Parliament will finally come to reach a closure on this very important issue.
Okay, and that was a question actually from Jassim Hussein in Bahrain. So do you think it's going to be continuity in the same issue that in the path that they have been pursuing so far in addressing the issue of the Bidoon? We saw recently that in fact, the Emir's son, who newly took a position within state security, may have taken a position that eased some of the difficulties of Bidoon that have security flags and files on their records. So do you think it's continuity in what we've seen before, or do you think there's going to be some new approaches to resolve that issue?
I think it will be a blend. We'll see a kind of reset of the relationship with the Bidoon. You've mentioned what Sheikh Salim and Nawaf has done, and there could be more steps along those lines. We've seen certain resolutions even by the government. For example, in Kuwait University, where I teach, we had an issue in which the degrees would not be passed along to the Bidoon because there was a nationality line that had to be filled. So the government cooperated and the Ministry of Education, and they lifted that out, and then the degrees were distributed. So there is that macro scene, the macro picture, but then there is our small, tools that we can work towards resolving this issue. So it's a blend, I would say to Mr. Jassim. It will be a mix of both.
Did anybody else want to comment on any of these issues? I see some of you sitting back, or should we move ahead for more questions? Okay. We have a question from Sarah Stewart, who's with AFP in Dubai. And she's asking, and this is an important one, I think, we've talked about the continuity that comes from staying with this kind of older seasoned leadership, but why wasn't Kuwait ready for generational change? And is that a concern? I would just add, she doesn't ask this, but is that a concern, having this sort of gap, especially when we look at a lot of the young leadership that's been taking over in a lot of the other Gulf countries and in the region?
I think it would be unhealthy to compare. Is someone else speaking, or should I?
No, go ahead. Better.
I think, look, Kuwait is Kuwait. And we have our own unique history. We have our own political practices. We have a system that we're proud of. And that system contains a lot of traits. One of them is trying to be gradual and trying to address the context on the ground. As you saw, there was, and Kristin, you mentioned this earlier, the past few years, we've seen competing factions in the ruling family. So today's nomination is a way towards healing those rifts from within. And I think that's a needed step before any shifts take place. And when someone says we need a generational shift, and Alanoud mentioned this very beautifully at the beginning of the talk when she said Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed can speak as adeptly to a 10-year-old as he could to an 80-year-old. And that skill is also that skill was with him, and you'll see it also with Sheikh Nawaf and Sheikh Mish'al. So it's what will the purpose be? Is it to have the needs of Kuwait better served, If that's the purpose, then we would need to find the answers to that question. And could it be generational shift at the moment? That will come. It will eventually come, but it'll come gradually and in accordance to the Kuwaiti context.
I was just going to stress that first point that Badr made. Kuwait is Kuwait. Kuwait's different from the other countries. And the expectation in Kuwait is always that the family has looked towards its senior members in terms of progression of leadership and whatever. And I think what we'll probably see is an effort by the two new individuals, Emir, Crown Prince to be, that they will try to engage, I think, some of the younger members of the family and other younger members into the government. I think that's what we will see. But I don't see that this is an issue for Kuwait.
We had a question about who do people think the prime minister will be? So that's kind of a way of getting to that question. Do you think maybe there'll be somebody younger as prime minister? And we kind of addressed that issue, but if anybody wants to throw out any ideas of who they think may be a candidate for prime minister. Dr. James,
I think that's far too hard to really gauge at this point. As we talk.
Yeah, I'm not going there, Kristin. I was going to say earlier that I had to laugh at how many of the things we're discussing here, we could, if you removed the title of the program, it could be the United States that we're talking about, you know, difficulty between the parliament, you know, the national council and the leadership and an older leadership. You know, this is what happens in democratic societies. And I agree with Skip. I think hard to predict prime minister. I do see, and I'm, again, this is listening to Dr. Badr and Alanoud, that, you know, you can just really see the gradual shift that will have more, you know, younger people and their voices heard, because let us remember the average age in Kuwait right now is 29.7 years or something like that. That's my daughter's, you know, that's, and so that's a young age. But so, you know, somehow you can bring in younger leadership at the ministerial, at the cabinet levels, and still provide them the umbrella of that comes with having senior leadership who know all of the moving parts in the machines. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, and we have seen, in fact, I mean, the son of Nasser Mohammed, who was kind of one of those candidates that people threw around as a potential candidate, is now foreign minister, correct? So we do see some of that next generation leadership moving up. Alanoud, we had a question about, do you foresee further change in the role of women within Kuwait? I invite you, you can even tell us a bit about some of these candidates, if you like, that are going to be running for parliament, or just your broader idea. And also, I would love to hear more from you, since you were active in this, about the new law that was just passed, the domestic violence law in the parliament.
Yes, well, that was a very proud day for Kuwait and for all the activists who are working towards positive change in Kuwait. Our domestic violence law passed on August 19, and on the same day there was a change in the censorship law, and another law that was to do with transportation, and they were all championed by civil society activists in Kuwait. And I think this is particularly a Kuwaiti flavor, that our civil society is active and it lobbies and it influences and it is listened to by those who are in policy making. You know, when you spoke about generational change, I was really hoping that we're going to speak about gender inclusion in that change. Kuwait has been unfortunately not really being fair to the amazing, ambitious women who are very well qualified in it, in that they don't occupy enough leadership positions, certainly not in parliament, where we have 1 woman to 49 men. We are trying to change that now through a platform that we just launched called Mudawi's List, that just highlights women running for office and tries to put them in touch with service providers, because women find a problem raising funds and getting the same kind of exposure as men do. And part of what you said about the question about a younger leadership, Kuwait always defies expectation. I don't think that necessarily our Crown Prince, who is now Emir, was the most media forward person or the person that experts expected to land the Crown Prince position and then become Emir. And likewise, Sheikh Mishal is not necessarily the one that most Kuwaiti experts gambled on, especially those abroad. And I think that those two roles are not necessarily going to be setting the day-to-day operations of the country. And that will be left to both younger, qualified members of the ruling family, those who haven't been tainted by allegations of corruption, those who haven't been involved in this factitious scramble for succession, and by young Kuwaiti men and women who are willing and able to serve this country and to make sure that its immense wealth and foreign policy legacy continues on.
And I'm curious, I mean, do you think those younger members within the ruling family exist? And I just throw this out there because I know when I was in Kuwait, gosh, I mean, it's been a long time ago. Maybe some of the first time I went to Kuwait, there were already kind of complaints about the fact that there was kind of a gap where there was missing some of this kind of next generation leadership within the ruling family. I'm just wondering if you think that is moving forward going to be a problem, though, as we look at this sort of generational transition. I don't know, Skip, or if you and Deborah want to speak to that at all.
Bro?
Well, I could speak to that. I worked with a number of them within government organizations. I'm sure Badr did as well. And they do exist, and they're highly educated and qualified and patriotic and ready to step in. And they've been working maybe with not a lot of media exposure, but they're certainly there, and they're well known to Kuwaiti people, and that's what matters.
Okay, excellent.
I second Alanoud. There is a lot of talent out there, Kristin. And I mean, Kuwait is a state of institutions. I always say this. And institutions are manned by people. And those are people from either the ruling family or outside it. And they're both very capable. And they're the hidden soldiers, if you may, Junud al-Majhula. And they support the infrastructure in place. I think with what's been taking place in Kuwait in the past week, Kuwait is in safe hands. It's moving forward. There is a sense of stability. The system is resilient. And I think that sends a good signal to Kuwaitis and to those observing Kuwait abroad.
So if I'd just say one small thing on the end of that. If there's one frustration that I've heard expressed, it's more the desire to let us unleash more of the energy and the capacity we have. And because there is huge capacity. And I think I've seen so many young Kuwaitis who've come back from overseas, educated, full of ambition, full of ideas, full of entrepreneurial ideas, because this is in the DNA of Kuwait. The politics and the commerce are in the DNA. And all they need is space. They just need the space to grow, what I call the liberating forum, to have, and this gets back then to 2035 and doing all the kinds of things that create that space for these for all this energy to flourish, because it's there. It's there in spades. It's huge.
And that's the challenge moving forward, is to meet those aspirations with bold policies, good governance, right choices. You know, I think it comes together in the executive branch, and that's where we see the moving forward after the next elections as key to pushing toward that direction in a more forceful way.
I think we've gotten most of the questions answered, and I apologize if you've thrown something in here that I've missed. But I wanted to offer to Ambassador Gnehm, since you've been there at some pivotal times in the history of Kuwait and thinking forward, just if you also have any thoughts about the main challenges that you see for Kuwait stepping ahead and where you see that going.
I think the major one is actually in the economic realm, and it is the issues that we talked about a bit earlier. there is a desperate need for legislation that permits the government to borrow and to be able to use the tools that most economists around the world do use to address the kind of problems that Kuwait faces. And obviously the one that Dr. Alanoud mentioned earlier about the jobs in government and all of the, we haven't really talked about it, but the perks that go to Kuwaiti citizens, whether it be the price of gasoline, the price of water, electricity. These are all things that need to be dealt with if the country is going to deal with the economics. I think that's the main one. And then, of course, the ongoing one forever for Kuwait is balancing its international relationships with its neighbors and dealing with those issues. The one that I do not see a problem, because I do believe in continuity in this, and that's the relationship between Kuwait and the United States. I think that is deeply embedded in the DNA, as Deborah used earlier, the DNA of Kuwaitis today. And it has been deftly worked by both our military and by the Kuwaitis themselves, as she alluded to earlier, to make certain that that presence in the country is not obtrusive, it is not threatening, and that it is in no way becomes an issue in the relationship. In fact, to the contrary, it's a very positive. So I'm very, very, maybe this is sort of my summary remark this morning, that I'm very confident about Kuwait. I see its future as a good one. I agree with everything that Dr. Bader said about the continuity, the confidence. I think this is just a great moment in time for the country and a great harbinger for a good future.
Dr. Jones, did you want to add anything? I'm sorry, Ambassador Jones.
I was hoping you'd given me one of Dr.
I'll give you mine.
We'll call you Ambassador Safir. I would just like to second that. I do think that everything else that Kuwait knows, that it is already on its agenda in terms of, effective, the civil service issues, sustainable environment, the health issues, all the things that any country deals with. Are all dependent on getting the economics in order. And we're all at a transitional phase that way. We have had battles here for years about government borrowing, et cetera, et cetera. We have those battles within my family's company. Should we borrow? Should we expend I think the answer is pretty clear. And I hope that Kuwaitis see that there's going to need to be this transitional period of public borrowing, not drawing down on your other assets that you have. And getting that in order will allow you to do all those other things with all the talent that you have. The vision is there, it's been spelled out. All of the issues are exactly the issues that need to be addressed, and you've got the means to do it. And, we're all here. We're all in this together because Kuwait's stability is really important to us as well, and the role that Kuwait plays is very important to the United States as well. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to work in one more question because I'm just curious, looking forward, where do you see the position of Kuwait? And I want to hear from Alanoud and Deborah on this. We've had this vision presented of Kuwait through this new city and port that would have Kuwait reach out to, potentially Iraq and Iran. We know we have a lot of competition in this area. Where do you really think Kuwait should be investing in its, and its people moving forward? And where do you see Kuwait positioning itself strategically, more in terms of the economy?
Well, I think the DNA that Ambassador Jones spoke about will surpass any hurdle, because the energy and the expectation to move forward has long characterized Kuwaitis, young and old. So that energy, that rush to provide services, and probably, Kristin, when you were in Kuwait, you noticed those many young businesses by young men and women, creative ideas. And even as I teach my own students here, I'm amazed at the kind of that raw energy that's just wanting to be channeled forward. And I think this is a strong point that could be cultivated even further when there is an enabling environment. We've seen more of an enabling environment elsewhere. It's our role now to push that forward. I see Kuwait's future pushing itself as an economic hub in connection to its strategic location next to Iraq. Iraq is a country that we've invested a lot in terms of a strong, healthy relationship. We would like to do more of that. And as Iraq stabilizes itself, we'll find a common ground to further that niche of the Northern Gulf forward.
Alanoud, any last thoughts?
I think that, entrepreneurship, wiliness, and creative problem solving are three components of Kuwait's leadership and its people. And as this, COVID-19 crisis forces the world's economy to grind to a halt and to reassess, I think Kuwait will be doing the same thing, but hopefully we will be able to move forward and find real solutions to our economic issues under this new leadership. Strategic decision making is going to be a big part of that.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I think we've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of ground still to be covered in Kuwait. I think we hear, and I think all of us are going to be watching with real interest to see the formation of the government moving forward and the direction that they choose to lead this population and the population engaging with the new government. I know I'm going to be happy to follow elections again in Kuwait. They're always one of the more exciting parts in the Gulf calendar is to see what comes up in elections. So thank you to all of you. Really appreciate all of your input and expertise and spending the time, and also for all of you asking questions. And we'll look forward to future events on Kuwait and the Gulf. Tune in with us again.